Hi, everybody. Are we missing anybody? Hi, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. We will begin with a brief acknowledgement of the Indigenous ties and history to the territory where some of us are meeting in person. And then I will introduce the chair and tell you a little bit about the event. At York University, we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which the university campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The university acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. This area, known as Takaranto, has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And it is also my pleasure to introduce the chair of the session, Debbie Douglas. Debbie is the executive director of OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, and through her work in the NGO sector, and particularly at OCASI, Ms. Douglas has highlighted issues of equity and inclusion, including race, gender, and sexual orientation within the immigration system, and she has promoted the creation of safe, welcoming spaces within the settlement and integration sector. I can also say definitively that the research on which we are reporting today would never have happened without her support and the hard work of several OCASI members and employees, and I especially want to thank Manoli Ekra and Martha Orlani, and my thanks to all of the OCASI members who participated in the research. So Debbie, it's yours.
Thank you, Valerie, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to be joining you here today to chat about the future of Ontario immigrant and refugee serving sector, learning from a global pandemic. We are pleased to welcome all presenters and participants to this webinar on the future of Ontario settlement sector. Our event this afternoon is being live streamed on YouTube. Please note that our presenter and discussant will present for a maximum of 1 hour, and we will have 30 minutes for question and answers after the presentation. However, if you have a pressing question following a presentation, please use the chat and we'll get to as many questions as possible. I am very pleased to welcome Professor John Shields and Ms. Tara Bedard for this webinar. Professor John Shields. John is a tenured full professor with over 25 years of university teaching and research experience in the areas of public administration and public policy, Canadian politics, the political economy of the labor market, and welfare state restructuring, immigrant settlement and integration policy and practices, and nonprofit sector studies. He's currently at the Toronto Metropolitan University. I much prefer ex-university. Ms. Tara Bedard. Tara is the executive director of the Waterloo Region Immigrant Partnership. Tara has over a decade of experience of working in the field of immigration, refugee rights, and diversity in numerous capacities, from researcher to senior management. Welcome both. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think it's going to be a little easier if I use the podium, so let me do that. So while I'm presenting today, and thank you, Debbie, for that introduction, this was very much a collaborative project, and I want to acknowledge that up front. And so I do want to point out here that Valerie Preston, who's the head of the BMRC partnership grant, and at York University, Jay Ash DeSouza, who's a researcher with the BMRC, and Manoli Ekra, who's the former chair, head of research at OCASI, and myself were all very much part of doing this research. So it was a collective project. I'm presenting on behalf of this larger group. Now, what I want to start with is that this is initial findings. So this is very much work in progress. This is looking at the larger project that this is part of is looking at the settlement sector in Ontario and Quebec through the pandemic period and then moving into the future. This Ontario survey was conducted in November and December of 2021, but it was looking back over the past year. And so it's looking, beyond, if you will, the first wave of the pandemic and into the subsequent waves of the pandemic. I think it also needs to be noted that the pandemic posed an immediate triple threat to the immigrant serving sector and to the serving agencies. And this was the threat of revenue loss, the threat of office closure, and service cancellations, and a host of human resource challenges. On the part of settlement workers, of course, there was the threat of job loss, and also a variety of health and safety concerns and issues that rose out of the pandemic. Of course, for immigrant newcomers, there was the threat of the loss of services, or services not being adequately delivered to them because of the need to move online. And during this very profound crisis, of course, agencies were threatened with not being able to meet their mission obligations. And I think this posed a more generic threat to the whole settlement sector within Ontario, and I think obviously throughout Canada as well as elsewhere. The settlement sector was challenged under these circumstances to embrace resilience and to shape shift into virtual modes, going fully online, a profound challenge. The data that we're going to present here speaks to the social resilience of the settlement sector in Ontario, and I think the sector in Ontario is very representative of other provinces' experiences as well. I know from talking to other people that a lot of that will resonate there, and that means not just the settlement agencies themselves, but the settlement workers, and also newcomers, and also the funders. All of those are part of that system and all had to adjust in very resilient ways. And I think, as we'll show from some of this work, a lot of success in terms of meeting some of these challenges, and perhaps the presentation of new opportunities moving into the future. So let me say a little bit about the questionnaires. Now, this survey was distributed to all OCASI member agencies, and as noted before, OCASI was very much a partner in this research. There were both English and French versions of the surveys that were done. The questionnaires were for managers within the agencies, the settlement agencies, and also to staff within the agencies. So there was 2 separate surveys. They were, as I said, both in French and English. They were, these surveys were available online through OCASI. They were sent to the OCASI member agencies through OCASI. For the manager surveys, actually, only one senior manager was asked to respond to the questions, so that we had, each organization represented by that. And then those organizations, those agencies were asked to send out the surveys to their workers to be able to respond to those questions. So that's kind of how the survey was organized in terms of being distributed. There were now, and they're just released today, 2 technical reports of the survey that are available on the BMRC website. I'm going to show you a slide shortly with the link there. So that will be coming up shortly, and we will, and it's also. So that slide and the executive summaries, are both in French and English. In terms of the reports, these reports are only in English at this point in time. And the reports, I must also add, they are technical reports, so we're not doing interpretation of the data there. We're laying out the descriptive statistics, the frequencies with respect to what each of the questions found. Now, in terms of responses, we thought, given the pandemic and all of the challenges of doing surveys during this period of time, that we had pretty reasonable response rates. Overall, there was, I think, 54 managers that agreed to do the survey. There was 255 staff members who agreed to do the survey. Now, in each question, there was actually somewhat less who actually went about and actually did the questions, but overall, we still had a pretty strong response rate here. The managers represented, the organizations represented a range of agencies throughout the province. So all areas of the province were represented within this. Of course, Toronto is a large draw because there's a lot of agencies in Toronto, but the whole province did have agencies who responded to the survey. The workers who took part in the survey mainly identified as women, over 75%, which actually gives us confidence because we know the sector is dominated by female workers. And also, the responses from the workers came from across the province as well. So they weren't just concentrated in just Toronto, they were spread out across the province. The other thing I think I should note here is that we're also going to be able to draw some comparisons between an earlier OCASI survey that was done during Wave 1. In August 2020, I made a little typo there, that should be 2020. Was done, and what we did is we sort of paralleled many of the same questions in our survey so that we could do some comparative analysis between the first wave in terms of what these OCASI agencies and workers were experiencing, and then the subsequent waves period that we were looking at. The other thing I should note is that with this overall work, we also have conducted some focus groups and may in fact do some more focus groups because the data tells us a lot, But to actually really get behind those numbers, we also need to hear the voices of people who are actually working within the sector. And so we've have done some of that, and hopefully we're going to be doing some more of that to give more meaning, I think, to these numbers. I'm presenting today, of course, a sampling of the responses. And if you look at the technical reports, I think you'll see pretty quickly that this was a pretty rich data set, these two surveys. And maybe I should just say the overall storyline before I get into the data itself. And basically, I think the storyline, or at least a good part of the storyline, is that the Ontario settlement agencies and workers have been highly resilient at adapting to serve clients in Ontario. And they've been also extremely adaptive in terms of their abilities to consolidate what was, obviously a very difficult sort of beginning to adjust to go online, and to really, I think in that second wave, I think we're showing it to manage very effectively through the crisis, and of course with, as I'll speak a little bit later to, the support of funders as well as part of that. So they've been able to stabilize operations and really, I think, operate at a very high level. And I think some of the data I'll present will demonstrate that. This is simply a timeline. It's a figure from Stats Canada, but it just gives us a sense of that pandemic period. And of course, the first OCASI survey was done towards the extreme left-hand side of that graph, and our survey was done towards the extreme right-hand side. So those are the kind of differences within timelines and within the pandemic periods. The report, as I said, is available now on the BMRC website. And again, you can use that link that's provided up there to find those reports. The reports are of the two technical papers that were done on each of the surveys, one of the management, the organizations, and the second of the frontline workers. And then there's also, along with those, executive summaries. The executive summaries are for both of these in English, and also the executive summaries are in French. Unfortunately, we don't have those full reports translated into French, but of course one could read the numbers quite easily from that those reports. And I should also note that Research at a Glance, if you're part of that link, produced by IRCC, has posted these today with the link, so that may be of use. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to start to open, I guess, with this slide, and basically here, this does give us, I think, a bit of a sense about what are some of the issues that have really been impacting the agencies during the COVID period. And what we find here is that respondents, and they could identify a number of factors here, right? They just didn't have to just pick one. But the respondents identified the following as leading impacts on agencies during the pandemic. The first was, the most prevalent was moved programs and services online. Not unsurprisingly, almost everybody said that was a major impact, almost 98%. developing new partnerships to continue to deliver programs and services. And again, 63% identified that as being quite significant. Experiencing revenue loss from user fees and fundraising, almost half, 48% identified that. There was another thing identified there about losing funding from core funders like government, and only 12.5% in this survey identified that. And I think this is part of the story here, is that part of the success is because the core government funders supported the organizations through the pandemic. The successes would not have been possible without that. Some other minor ones that are not highlighted here, not minor ones, but secondary ones that were identified, was that staff had contracted COVID. 44% of staff actually got COVID during this period. I think that's a pretty interesting number. And also, of course, clients who had gotten COVID, and also the loss of volunteers. 40% of agencies reported the severe loss of volunteers. And that was something that also plagued the whole nonprofit sector. And of course, many other nonprofit organizations are very heavily dependent upon volunteers. In the settlement sector, while volunteers are important, much of the work is actually done by paid workers. But still, this was certainly an impact on the sector. I'm going to move to these pie graphs next, and they're looking at trends in terms of clientele. And what the first pie graph is suggesting here is that there was a stable or increasing number of clients for the sector during this second to fifth wave recollection of and this is from the managers in this part. So 45% said that there was an increase in the number of clientele, and about 11% said it stayed the same. So over 55% were saying that, okay, the numbers are quite good in terms of our clientele here. And in fact, if you look a bit deeper into the data, and you can do that by going to the technical reports, many other agencies said they were very close to getting at pre-pandemic levels in terms of the numbers of clients that they were serving. In the second pie graph, it's actually looking at, actually maybe I'll just add one more thing before I move to the second pie graph, and that is in the workers survey, when they were asked a similar kind of question, about 58% agreed that client services during this time had increased, which may also indicate about some increases in numbers of clients being served. For the second pie graph, it indicates that more is coming, that is, more clients are coming from outside the local catchment area. In fact, 68% agreed that there was an increase in terms of clients served outside of that area that they would normally do so. And of course, that was possible because of the movement to digital online types of services. And that does open some really interesting questions. On the one hand, there is a possibility, especially in the post-pandemic period, that you may get greater competition between agencies competing for clients. And I think a more competitive environment for the sector would be actually quite destabilizing. So I think there are some issues there, I think, that need to be thought about and need to be addressed. On another level, however, this has allowed actually many agencies to reach out to clients who've not been served in the past or not been served very well, either because they are in smaller cities, smaller towns, more rural types of areas, maybe even some suburban types of areas, or because of their particular circumstances. Many women with children, for example, with young children, weren't able to use many of the services because of childcare issues. And with the pandemic and the movement online, actually, many of those women were able to take advantage of some programming now that was delivered in a different way. So I think there's some really, interesting aspects that are coming out of that, those pie graphs. The next I want to look at is the idea of client satisfaction with the quality of the services being delivered. And these are looking at the worker surveys. And the first set of numbers there is actually from the OCASI Wave 1 survey that was done in August 2020. And the second one is the new survey that was out in the field in November and December 2021. And basically, I think the really good news here is that there's a very high level of satisfaction with the quality of services. And in fact, it was high from the very beginning. And that pattern of the strength of the quality of the services increased a little bit, but there was a continuity between the two periods. There hasn't been, maybe because of COVID fatigue or whatever, a loss in that kind of quality. It's maintained its quality, in fact, enhanced it a little bit. And in fact, if we looked at dissatisfaction with the quality of services, in the first wave done by OCASI in 2020, only about 5%, just a little over 5%, had dissatisfaction with that. And then in our survey, that actually had decreased a little bit more. So it's a slight decrease, but it's a decrease, about 3.64%. And then a lot of people, a third of the sample, was satisfied. So these, I think, are really strong numbers. And I think they are important. And I think they speak to the level of successful adjustment of the agencies during the pandemic. So that's one of the indicators, or one of the markers, I think of this. Now this next group of tables here. The first one, once again, is from the OCASI First Wave Survey, and the second is from our more recent survey. And it does ask the question about, has your organization had difficulties with clients who've had a difficult time coming online for those services? And what we're finding here, and in fact the numbers are very similar between the two surveys, is that most agencies, over 70%, 78% of agencies had at least some clients that continue to experience digital service problems. And so, while clearly the future of the settlement sector is one that's going to embrace digital services, there's also a clear need for continuing front-facing service provision as well. And I guess the other thing I would note about this is that, and this is part of the Canadian settlement model, is that the idea was for, of course, government funding, but services to provided by nonprofit agencies rooted in immigrant communities by and large. And to continue, I think, that connection to the community, it's important to have the front-facing part of that as well. So there'll be some, I suspect, some hybrid model that's going to arise from this, but that sort of front-facing part remains important, both to many, especially the most vulnerable migrant clients, but also, I think, for the integrity of that kind of community-oriented type of delivery that the settlement sector has become so known for worldwide. The other pie graph I want to present here has to do with revenue and the stability of the revenue. And again, I think there's some good news with respect to this. I would remind folks, and many of you will certainly know this, that 80 to 90% of the funding of most of the settlement agencies does come from government. But that also means that there's a portion of it that does not come from government. And that was, in fact, much more vulnerable during especially the opening days and opening weeks and months of the pandemic. And I think the first survey that OCASI did definitely demonstrated that. And there was some job losses and impacts on services as a consequence of that. But when we're looking at the current figures, and that's where this pie graph comes from, what it shows is that about 70% of organizations had no drop in revenue this time through. And that compares to the first wave of the OCASI survey, where only 43% of organizations could report the same thing. So I think there's been some improvement in terms of the financial situation. And again, these are reported by the managers themselves. And I think the stability of financing and the flexibility of that financing that was done during the pandemic was really key to the resilient response that had gone, that's been part of this whole process. And I should note, just in terms of IRCC, during that initial period when the pandemic first arose, is that they did make pretty superhuman efforts to approve of $4 billion worth of contracts that were signed for 5 years. That was done in 2020. And this is in the middle of the pandemic when the offices are closed down. This was very important to the agencies. And I think that speaks to the flexibility, and it's part of the social resilience, I think, story that we're trying to uncover here. So clearly, this is very important. From the focus groups, we have certainly heard that continued continuity in the financing and flexibility in financing was key to success, and that this is something that the sector sees as very vital going into the future, into the post-pandemic world, that we shouldn't just return to past practices. We need to learn from these types of experiences and begin to recognize those learnings and adapt our models to those learnings. Now, this next table is looking at how has staff management relations changed in the past 12 months of the pandemic. And again, I think there's very strong, significant results. And you have to remind yourselves again that this is a sector that's been under tremendous stress for 2 years going on. And so what we're finding is that the majority of respondents said that actually staff management relations have remained relatively the same, over 50%, 53% said that. And a further 34% said actually relationships have improved. And only 12.8% said no, things have not improved. They've gotten a bit worse, at least, or worse, or a bit worse, or maybe a little bit more than worse. But I think those are pretty staggering findings, and I think it also speaks to some of the issues of social resilience that we'll want to follow up on. But I think that's, a very good part of the story here. Now, the other part here is that we've heard a lot about collaborations and the increase in the number of collaborations during the pandemic. And again, this is from the managers, and in this pie graph, a majority, over 72%, reported that there were more collaborations going on. And during the first OCASI survey, this number was also healthy at about 62%, but it's increased since the second survey. And so that collaboration continues to build, it would seem. Now, we need, of course, more detail about what kinds of collaborations these are, with whom, what are their depth, what's the depth of these collaborations, and the qualitative focus groups that we're doing actually begin to give us some indication of this. I think this is where we can sort of learn more about these. And one of the things it's saying, at least from those initial ones, is that actually a lot of that collaboration is between settlement agencies, but going outside of the regular sort of settlement sector itself. So looking at working more closely with health organizations, with food banks, with schools. And the emphasis of the key role of collaboration and that it can play in the settlement sector moving forward, I think is an important aspect and an important story, because I think it speaks to the idea of a less competitive type of system, and in fact a more cooperative model and a more sharing model that's necessary here. A whole of society model that I think is really important. I think that we need to talk about moving into the future. The next pie graph here is looking at, as it says here, turbulent times, upended plans. And this again is from the manager surveys. And what it indicates is that organizations are facing continuous change. I mean, we know nonprofit organizations are always facing change, but obviously the pandemic has really sort of moved this to a different level and a different scale. And of course, that change can be quite disruptive for organizations. And as some of the other tables that we're presenting here suggests, is that the organizations are actually managing this change pretty well. I'm not saying this is easy to do, but the organizations have had a lot of success at organizing a host of changes that they have been faced with. And this table looks at how much the range of services offered by their organization had changed over the past 12 months of the pandemic. And again, I think some interesting findings. And to some degree here, the experience is a bit bifurcated. A plurality of respondents said that the range of services over the past 12 months for their organizations had changed a moderate amount. So 35, 36%, with the next largest response being a great deal. And so that's, 27% of the sample. So I think there's some signs of, if I can put it this way, of relative continuity amidst change in terms of how that change is being managed. And the service changes, obviously, as this table reveals, are very much part of the life of most of the organizations that we were able to survey here. And the next pie graph is looking at workplace return. And here is, how much did your organization modify its plan to return to the workplace during the past 12 months of the pandemic? And once again, what we're seeing is that there's been a considerable amount of modification to the return to workplace. As you know, all of our expectations about how long this pandemic would last were defied, and it kept going on, and so plans had to continuously be altered. And again, as I think other slides will show and do show, is that the organizations have been managing that change pretty well. I'm not sure my university has managed it as well as the settlement agencies, but I think that there's quite an impressive record there. Now, this one is looking at workers' view of the pandemic response. And again, here the question is, has your organization taken appropriate action in responding to the pandemic in the past 12 months? Here, again, I think a really strong figure is that over 72% of workers thought their employers, their organizations, had taken appropriate actions in response to the pandemic. There was actually only a very small negative number of people who said that no, they hadn't. Some were neutral, but most organizations, or workers within those organizations that we surveyed, said that this was being handled pretty well. And I think that very positive worker views reflects also that previous table I showed you with respect to labor management relations. There's some positive things that have come out of the pandemic, I think, in relationship to this. And again, I think this is in part important in terms of social resilience, in terms of talking about the importance of cooperation, in terms of coming out with good ends. And part of that obviously is the management worker type of dimension to it. And I think these figures are quite revealing in that regard. Now, in terms of workers' views about working from home, and there's a lot more data than this in the report, so I would urge you to take a look at them. But and again, people were able to respond to multiple. They didn't have to just choose one; they could respond to multiple things in what we're drawing out of here in most cases. So most, that is 90%, got a laptop to work from home. A very strong majority, 77%, were satisfied with working from home. About half of them felt more productive working from home. And a large percentage also said that they were at least as productive working at home as they were working in the office. Mental health issues and work-life balance and social isolation are workers' main concerns with respect to working from home. And over 86% of staff were willing to return to the office, especially with vaccine mandates. I know time has moved on, so it'd be interesting to, not that we're doing another survey at this point, to see what people would say on that issue today. Also, a large majority of workers would like to continue working from home as part of their work week, as part of a hybrid model. So there's a lot of interest and acceptance in terms of wanting to do that. In fact, a lot of them would actually prefer to spend more time at home and less time in the workplace as part of that work breakout, right? And some would like to spend all their time at home, and some would, a few also, a smaller number would like just go back permanently. But many, wanted that split to be one that's more at home and less at work. So that is one of the challenges, I think, in working out what the new hybrid model is going to look like in practice. Because, obviously organizations want to move, I think, most to a hybrid model, but what that split is going to be, I think, is going to be a matter of some discussion and negotiation. Now, this table is looking at the issue of post-pandemic government funding, and it's from management in this case. And based on your organization's experience in the past 12 months of the pandemic, do you expect that the post-pandemic government funding will be. And again, there's a number of choices here that they have to choose one of. Will increase significantly. Will increase sufficiently, 10.6% in a bit. Will not increase enough to cover needs, 36.1%. Obviously, lots of anxiety with respect to this. Will not change, 25.5%. Will decline, 21.23%. So about 57% and change believed that there's some issues going forward in terms of funding from their opinion. That either it's not going to increase enough to cover costs, or that it's going to decrease into the future. And so obviously that is a matter of concern. We also heard that in the focus groups that we did about what is this, that uncertainty about what the funding is going to look like going into the future. And this next one is about, the question reads, given the challenges of returning to the workplace and the possibility of resuming normal operations after the past 12 months of the pandemic, do you expect that your funders will? And please select all that you agree with. And in this case, 60% said that they would continue to fund at current service levels. But of course, we have to remember that that's in the context that there may be more need. There may be more people coming through the system. And of course, we know with the Afghans and with the Ukrainians that there is another high demand within the system. So how is that going to be adjusted? The IRCC has begun to address some of those things, but there's still a lot of concern out there with respect to that. The other response was return to pre-pandemic expectation and services. Over 50%, 51% identified this, and this is a real concern with many agencies around ending stable and more flexible forms of funding. I think that the flexible part is the key part. I don't think there's an expectation that funds are somehow going to suddenly disappear from the sector. But in the context of the pandemic and deficits, there are issues. Some are certainly concerned about that, and maybe with some reason. And the last was reduced funding while expecting pre-pandemic targets, service targets at 17% identified that. So there's a concern expressed, as I said, in the focus groups that we've done with the settlement, with settlement service providers, that the lessons of the of this relationship that developed during crisis between funder and agencies may be lost. That those lessons may not be recognized, may not be sort of acted upon. And I think there's a real concern and I think also an opportunity here that we can build upon some of these successes that we've seen during the pandemic for the future of the settlement sector. The last figure table, I guess, I'm going to present here. And I do this in terms of wrapping up, is the continued concerns. This identifies continued concerns that workers have with respect to COVID or another kind of crisis of its kind. And the four most frequent concerns that were identified here is that around physical health impacts, especially stress, that was so prevalent during COVID. 63% of respondents said, yeah, that's an ongoing kind of concern going into the future. Economic repercussions, whether that's at the local, provincial, national, international kind of level, 53% of people identified that. Funding reductions, 43% identified that, because of course the funding reductions are attached to their jobs and also to their working conditions and health and safety that might be involved with respect to that. And then 28% identified that being forced back to work and some of the threats to the well-being of family that could have. So still some of this post-pandemic types of issues. So that's a highlight of some of the material that's contained in these reports. I think in conclusion, there's many examples of settlement agencies and settlement workers demonstrating, I think, an impressive level of resilience and of the consolidation of the capacity and the adaptability in the context of continuous change. And, but also a great deal of uncertainty going into the future. And that uncertainty, is centered very much around funding and the type of funding and the flexibility of that funding. Also the expansion of the demands on services without commensurate expansion of funds with respect to that. And hopefully these slides have given us a little bit of a snapshot of the settlement agencies and their workers during this period. And let me say that there's more to come. We've only touched upon beginning to start to do some analysis of this. And finally, there's lots of people that need some thanks in terms of being able to conduct this work. First of all, to the frontline workers and managers throughout Ontario, the ISAs, and thanks again to OCASI agencies and workers for being part of this. And also I want to thank the organizations and the workers for the yeoman's work they've been doing during this whole pandemic period. They truly are heroes within the system. I also want to thank, of course, the OCASI staff, who this survey would not have been possible without their participation and cooperation and partnership. Damaris Rose and Anik Dauphin, who helped throughout this process in terms of giving us advice at key points in time. To Shanaz Fakim at BM, now I'm beginning to lose my train of thought here, BMRC, to the BMRC advisory group in this project, which is composed of academics and community representatives who are part of this project. They've helped guide us through this process. So I have no idea how much time I've taken on this. I always take way too much time, but thank you for your putting up with me.
Thank you very much, John. And now to hear from our colleague, Tara Bedard, the Executive Director of the Waterloo Region Immigration Partnership. Tara?
Thanks, Debbie. Does this work?
Yep.
I don't have to do anything to it?
No.
Okay, great.
It's working.
Okay, awesome. That was awesome, John. Thanks for having me here today. I'm going to be pretty quick because I think I'd rather just leave the time for people to ask questions and hear what resonates with others from the research that John just presented. But I'll share a few thoughts that I have for myself, having been involved in the work of this research partnership over the last 5 years, my own learning about resilience and social resilience, the work that I do through the Immigration Partnership in Waterloo Region and with our settlement partners in that region and across many other organizations and with our university partners in the region, some of the work that we are doing. And I'm really just going to hone in on one of the charts that John presented at the beginning, which was around perceptions of the pandemic impacts that were shared by the workers and management in the survey, and really hone in on the top three, because I think they're the ones that really resonate in everything that I see day to day with the work that our partners are doing, and through the research that I've been watching through all of this partnership project. And that, you know, in order of precedent, they were shown to be the move online, new partnerships, and experience with revenues and lost revenues. And I really think that those are the big three that I see in the work that I do and the interactions that I have. And so just with the move online, you know, and the reflection of folks in the settlement sector that, you know, they have had a very high satisfaction with, you know, I guess their ability to move the services online and their perceptions of how their clients experience those services having moved online, recognizing that, you know, the ability of everybody to engage with digital services is not the same, so it's not a good experience for everybody in the same way, but I think that broadly is reflective of what we see when we're doing our work, and I'm going to speak really about our work in Waterloo Region, where we are with our settlement partners, and we do an immigrant survey every other year, and we just ran it last year, and that was, you know, kind of a year and a bit into the pandemic, and we asked some very targeted questions of immigrants in our region about their experiences with services, and specifically the online services. And I think that what we saw here in this survey of the workers is very reflective of what we heard, and we had a pretty good sample of just over 1,500 immigrants. And so I think, you know, I feel very happy seeing, you know, strong correlation between what we're hearing from people on the ground in our community and their experiences of the services with the impressions and like what you know, the gut instinct of people working in the sector, and having their pulse on really, you know, kind of what people are feeling, you know, and recognizing that, you know, online is here to stay, but, you know, it is a challenge for some people, and this is also very human-centric work, and so online is great for many reasons and in many instances, but not in all. And so I think what I take from this and what I hear from our partners and what we hear from newcomers on the ground is, you know, the need to think thoughtfully as we move into the future, and if we're being resilient, that is adapting to the experiences that we have come from, and as we move forward, to think about, you know, what are the right ways of making services available to people, what is the right mix of online and in person and et cetera. And I know that our partners on the ground want to be thoughtful, they want to be really responsive and adaptive and available for people in our community in the way that they need them to show up. And so that is from a resilience perspective. And to that first point about the move online and how big that was, those are some of the reflections that I think that I have. The second was about new partnerships, and for sure, hands down, we saw this very, very much in our work in Waterloo Region, and I think it's come out very strongly in all of the research undertaken in this project, and it was huge here. And, you know, shape-shifting in terms of partnerships, like within organizations, among staff working together in different ways, with organizations, you know, working across the settlement sector, and how they were collaborating as a sector together throughout, you know, the early phases even, and now still, you know, kind of 2 and a bit years into the pandemic. But also, and very, very importantly, outside of the sector and with all of the other places and spaces where immigrants are interacting, and, you know, I think within pandemic structures, as we were operating as a community, the engagement of our settlement partners, you know, they were able to do a lot of new and different things with many organizations that they had not worked with in the same way prior to the pandemic. And I think hands down, I can say that, throughout the work of the pandemic, it was definitely made stronger because of the engagement of our settlement partners. And when I think about, the health equity pieces and all of that, that work that was done in community, through public health and others, it would not have been the same without the engagement of folks in the settlement sector. And so the ability to sustain those partnerships going forward and to continue to adapt how we work together cross-sectorally is really important. And, there's no looking back. I think, we think about like so much of, what are we, how are we going to get back to where we were? And I don't know, do we want to do that? Because I think we've learned so much and, we've improved the way that we're able to work together and for people. And so really a strong focus on, how do we sustain all of the positive momentum that we have been able to make in really solidifying, the role of this sector as a enabler of the work of others and other people working in other sectors and spaces, because immigrants interact across society like anybody else. And so I think that is really important. And then to the third piece on, experiences of lost revenue and worry about that, for sure, it's a huge worry for all of our partners. And, when we are spending all of our time being worried about revenues and focused on fundraising, it draws our focus and our ability to deliver on mission. And so I think that, I think for everybody to look at, kind of what were those changes that happened during the pandemic that enabled organizations to be able to show up for people in our communities in the ways that they needed to. A lot of that did come down to funding, federal and provincial funders, being open, flexible, adaptable, stable for organizations, really allowed organizations to deal with, kind of where private donations and others had fallen off. And, we don't know what we're going into coming out of the pandemic. And so I think, as we are moving forward, how do we look at sustaining what we were able to gain in terms of how the organizations delivering services work in relationship with the funding agencies and, in more of a spirit of partnership and trust, and one that allows, really just focuses on the fact that organizations know what they need to do in order to serve their communities, and how do funders, whether they be government or, private philanthropic or others, really just enable them to do what needs to be done in communities. And I think I'll stop there and open it for others.
Thank you, Tara. I think you really picked up on some of the key issues, especially I was struck by the fact that at the beginning of the pandemic with the OCASI First survey, we saw the high number of client concern around access to digital services, and a year later, it's the same thing. So I think the first question to the two of you, while we wait for our online audience, we know you're there, please send us in your questions. How do we respond to that? I think, John, you're absolutely correct, and Tara, we're not looking backwards, right? We are moving forward. Hybrid service delivery is the way of the future in the immigrant and refugee serving sector here in Ontario, but across the country. How do we ensure that all of our clients, we have to pay attention to issues of class and access. How do we ensure that they're able to access the online services that our agencies will be providing? What's the role of government in this, and what's the role of the sector in ensuring that government and other funders step up?
Maybe
John?
I'll jump in first. And I'll just say, well, first of all, obviously, we need both frontline services as well as digital services, so it needs to be a hybrid model. There's going to be some clients who I think for language reasons or other reasons are just going to find it very hard to use the online services. Now, having said that, I think we also need some programming that would be available to clients that are having more challenges, that could give them some background in terms of, first of all, accessing technology, And of course, a lot of people had a lot of trouble getting technology because they might have been reliant upon the library, which were closed during the pandemic. They may have one computer in their household. There may be multiple people sort of using it. So I think there's lots of access kinds of issues. But also just instruction about how to, do online services. So, some basics about, how would I access, how would I use these types of services. Part of that might be able to be done through clear, plain language instructions, maybe in multiple languages. But others, I think, may actually require some actual programs that address, especially those vulnerable types of populations. So I think that's a start. Part of the problem is that, using the internet's pretty damn expensive in Canada. So there's a problem of more affordable, this bigger problem of more affordable access to that. You can't always go to a public library or other places to do that. So I think that's also a bigger issue. But I guess that would be my initial response.
Yeah. Tara?
Sorry. Here it comes. I think I would just add to what John has said. I think that when we're talking about immigrants and the role of government when it comes to immigration and, particularly vulnerable groups who are coming into Canada, one thing I think, and I know that there's been some movement with the supports that IRCC provides, for example, to government-assisted refugees in terms of computer access in the first year that they're here, But I think when we're bringing in particularly vulnerable groups, as with any form of support, income or other that folks are given, like a computer in hand of families is essential in this day and age, and to solidify that and to make it a regular part of the assistance that vulnerable groups of immigrants are given as they are brought into Canada and supported in their journey of getting settled. And I think, there's just a broader question because for many people it's an income issue. What do income supports look like in Ontario and other provinces so that families have the resources that they need in order to be able to afford the technology and to pay the internet fees that prevent them. We heard so many stories of people clamoring outside of our public libraries or our schools in the evenings to try to access Wi-Fi because they don't have the ability to have it at home. So just income levels in general.
Thank you so much for that, and for John, the mention of libraries, especially as we know here in Ontario, libraries are under threat in terms of cuts to their budget. We're going to go to a question in our in-house audience. Valerie?
Okay. There's a program that began in York Region developing tablets for seniors to try and provide them with both, and they have some kind of consultation, some helpline that they run along with it. Is that the kind of support that newcomers need? Because newcomers sound like a really diverse group to me.
Yeah.
So can you expand on what you think is, part of it I know is income, but what else is needed? Is it that kind of program?
I would say for some immigrants that is needed. Obviously, seniors, I think this is a really brilliant program, but I think for others who've, some immigrants are very adept at technology, and I think the pandemic has shown this, is that, they're a heck of a lot more adept than I am with the technology, and that's part of the success story, I think, here. That's where the access, I think, becomes an issue. But I think, there is still a group of immigrants, I'm not sure what the size of that group is, whether it's 10% or whatever of the population that do have other needs, and I think we're going to need more specialized outreach to them, and I think this is a good example of that. For other groups, the seniors one may not be the most appropriate one, but something's going to have to be tailored to that group that's going to give them better ability to interact digitally. But again, I think digital is obviously part of the future, is an important part of the future, but we can't, that can't mean that frontline services disappear.
In person.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to staying connected to the community, and I think it's really important for connecting to some members and also some immigrant clients, but also I think for some programs, I think they're just much better in person than they can be done online. Not for all programs, but for some. So I think the idea of hybrid, we have to take that literally, is that there's got to be two parts to this.
Tara?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's no one size fits all. This is not just about immigrants, it's about people in general, right? So yes, computers and tablets in hand is one barrier for some people. Income and ability to afford, like all of the cost of being online, is another thing. How do you use the technology once you have it is a whole other piece. And so yes, like programs that support people to be able to learn. I myself am like very limited with my capacity to use all the technology, right? Like there's like a learning curve for all of us. So I think that what the pandemic has shown very much is that everything is integrated and everything is connected, and you have to think holistically about how things operate and are connected. And that is true when you're looking at, how do you respond to making sure that people have everything they need when it comes to like any one piece, like for example, digital access.
And I think what's exciting is that many of our service agencies are beginning to think through how do you begin to include digital literacy as part of language training, as an example. Another question, please introduce yourself.
My name is Michaela Hinia. I'm with York University. Thank you for the presentation. That was very interesting. And I actually have a question that builds on in terms of digital access. Sorry. I think I'm cutting out. And I was really interested that there are, or that one of the things that happened was that workers were serving clients outside of their catchment area. And I started thinking about if we are moving towards a hybrid or digital future, and we have a settlement sector that is built on geographic service, is there both an opportunity now to think about how services are distributed across different agencies, and is there any movement to collaboration between agencies to think about how they might redistribute clients based on the potential that digital access provides, which is that you're no longer bound by geography, and maybe reflecting on what the benefits and challenges of that might be?
Good question. Tara, is the conversation happening especially within the local immigration partnerships?
Yeah, I think that's something that people are definitely looking at. I think for the direct service organizations, looking at what this means in terms of one, ability to expand services, and two, also the impact of others expanding into what has been your traditional catchment area and how that might impact sustainability of your own organization in the future. And it's definitely something that with immigration partnerships, across Ontario and Canada, we're looking at, and we're able to do a lot more collaboratively. For example, I think of some of the employer engagement work that we do, being able to, the bringing things online is really we're able to pool resources and pull things together and, offer things for employers across a large area that, it's maybe somebody's strength over here and not so much in this area, but together we can create a platform that we can then push out and make available to everybody to sustain learning. and engagement. So there's a lot of opportunities, and I think also some challenges that really need to be thought through in terms of what is the service sector or the service landscape going to look like going forward. And I think, you know, I would err on the side of doing that very thoughtfully. And again, I just come back to, you know, this is very human-centered work, and having a person in front of you is very different than doing everything through computers, and especially with the links to, you know, it's settlement and integration, right? Settlement and integration in communities happens through people and connections and relationships. And so being very careful, I think, about the balance as we move toward how much we can do online, and how much, you know, we really need to have for people to become, you know, to really get integrated and develop a sense of belonging in their communities. So.
Yeah, I think one of the real challenges is that we have a funding model that's based upon competition for grants. And that has advantaged larger organizations over smaller organizations. And so this has the danger of opening up a world where there's even more competition, and where you know, agencies that are not part of communities are delivering services that may hurt that kind of, you know, community dimension of it. But moreover, it may just intensify competition within the sector that's already been plagued, I think, with the problem of too much competition and not enough cooperation. And so agencies, which are fearful, are going to bid for these contracts, and you may have a winner-take-all kind of process happening there. So I think, you know, obviously we need to move to digitalization for a whole variety of reasons. And I think that's also in the interest of immigrants. But I think we have to have a funding model that's going to be altered, that can allow for cooperation and not be overtaken by this, you know, new public management kind of competitive model that's dominated the sector for the past 30 years.
Thank you, and I think Tara hit on it when she talked about that agencies themselves are beginning to work cooperatively to see how it is. We're seeing increasingly mergers happening in the sector, but even when there isn't a formal merger, you're seeing this kind of, I identify my strength, I will do this piece, you do this piece, as a way of pushing out the work to meet a wider audience. Next question.
Hi, Damaris Rose from the INRS in Montreal. Thank you to the chair and the panelists. I have a question about volunteers. In the report, the management report, you report on questions that included that there was concern about the loss of volunteers during the pandemic. So I'm wondering, medium term, how do you see the impact of virtual and hybrid models on the recruitment of volunteers and what the volunteers will do? Now, I know that's not a question that has a single answer, because the role of volunteers varies between the size and type of organization and the program being delivered, but any thoughts about that would be very interesting.
Well, let me just say that the survey didn't really go into, I think it was one question that was part of a question within the survey. So we didn't have a chance to go into a lot of depth with that. But, you know, volunteering in the nonprofit sector obviously has been really important. As I noted, most of the settlement agencies are actually, they're human resource intensive, but it's mostly paid workers in this sector. Other parts of the nonprofit sector are very volunteer-based in terms of the service delivery. But still, volunteers play an important role here. And obviously the pandemic really lessened that in a whole variety of ways, and we saw that in the general nonprofit sector, which was very damaging to them. Also, many agencies encourage immigrants to do volunteering so that they can actually get some, you know, experience in a letter of reference and so forth. So this is pretty standard practice among many types of agencies, and this was hindered, obviously, during the pandemic. Obviously, there's many volunteers who could go online to do volunteering, and many do. although that does require a certain degree of skill, and that's, some people are attracted to that, other people are not so attracted to that. So the volunteering, I think, profile will change over time. We already know with younger people that they're more episodic in terms of their volunteering. So there's been a demographic shift that's also altering this. But I think it has particular implications for the settlement sector, and I think we do need to look at that more closely. And unfortunately, this survey hasn't gone into that kind of level of depth to consider it. But I think it's a really good question.
I agree with everything that John just said, and if I look at kind of what I see of community in general in Waterloo Region, work with our settlement partners and with other nonprofit organizations and our Volunteer Action Center, like a really big shift through the pandemic with volunteering, and many people, like, traditional volunteers not volunteering because of the pandemic and unknowns with the health situation, and what are going to, how's that going to change as we come out of the pandemic? A lot of volunteers tended to be older, and they're kind of not interested in coming back. And so one is, I guess, pool of volunteers that are available in communities to support the work of, like, immigrant serving organizations and others. And yeah, John said, like, with younger folks, different ways of volunteering and different interests in volunteering are things that I hear a lot. And so I think to this question, like, literally everything, I think, as we're coming out of the pandemic, like, we're re-envisioning our society, and it's part of, like, a continuous learning of, just being able to understand the changes in our environment and how we adapt to those organizationally. This is just one more piece of the whole social resilience model of, I don't know exactly where it's going to go, but I just think we have to be open to the learning, have the capacity to do the learning. That's another thing that I didn't remember to say when IRCC was still here, like, invest in organizations' capacity to be able to learn and adapt from what is happening around them.
Can I just add another point there? And that is, of course, in the settlement sector, mentorships are really important. And co-ops, and many of those co-ops are not paid co-ops. So they're kind of a form of volunteering, I guess. And so, that really helps build the social capital of many immigrants and connect them to employment opportunities. And so a lot of those were lost during the pandemic, and I think there is some re-envisioning about how to do some of that online, and obviously as things open up to get back into personal contact and be able to do that. But I think that's part of that dimension of volunteering in the sector that's really kind of critical for settlement.
Thank you both. Before I come to our last in-person question, we have a comment from our audience online. They write, worried about excluding people who can't access virtual space and devices for many reasons: privacy, poverty, PTSD, etc. Deeply worried about new barriers as IRCC moves to digital-only access. Any thoughts? And not only in terms of service delivery, but also in terms of immigration processes. You will remember a few weeks ago when when IRCC announced that it was moving to online-only applications for refugee claimants, as an example. And there was enough of a pushback from advocacy organizations that they backtracked on that. But more and more, we're seeing the use of AI and those kinds of things. What's your thoughts about what's happening in that way? Tara?
Yeah, I agree. It's a real problem. And I just, to root this again in all of the learning of the pandemic, I think that we as a society, people in government and policymakers just really need to grapple with the fact that one size does not fit all. Not everybody has the same capacity to engage with digital online technologies, and, to be a truly inclusive country where we are providing for the needs of everybody. We can't have an only virtual world.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I don't know what more to say to that, except I fully agree with the concern.
Yeah. And all I can say is that's right on. Totally agree with that.
Yeah. And our last question.
Great, thanks very much for the presentation. It's
Tell us who you are.
Margaret Walton Roberts from Wilfrid Laurier University and part of the BMRC group. I'm very struck in listening to this discussion about other discussions I've heard from other sectors. So the engagement with recognizing the benefits, the pros and cons of going online, both from hearing it from the legal profession, through the court system, but also just recently from family physicians who had to pivot to online for virtual consultations. And some of the concerns that have come through in research with the family physicians is very similar in terms of recognizing that one size doesn't fit all, but also recognizing that for some clients that's what they want and that people don't want to go back, right? So people want to retain that ability. The interesting thing for family physicians was they had an issue with funding because there were no codes in Ontario for a virtual consult. And so there was a challenge there for them to figure out how to get funded for doing that work. And I'm just wondering, with the immigration sector, what happened with regards to that? Was the funding formula already such that it didn't really have a bearing on how people managed with clients? Was it just, okay, we've dealt with clients regardless of whether it was online or in person? I just wonder if there is, if you could provide a bit more detail about what that pivot meant in terms of how immigration serving organizations were able to access funds. Thanks.
Tara?
I think Debbie should answer this.
I know I should not.
I'll start at a very high level because I'm not in a direct service organization, but what I understand from our partners is that there was just a lot of flexibility on the part of the government, and nothing changed in terms of the way that they were reporting in who they were serving and how many people they were serving, and whether or not it was online or in person. I don't think that changed, and that wasn't something that they needed to account for, just that work was happening. And I think that is brilliant, because what is the difference? To that, for the settlement sector, the funding levels remain stable, and so they didn't have to worry about the counting of, are we meeting the targets that were set before the pandemic, because government allowed for flexibility for, in terms of the numbers of clients that people were seeing, which was very good, because although, kind of overall numbers of clients was going down, the number of service interactions was going up, and the length of time that it was taking to support people, because the needs were so much bigger, was a lot longer. So people had a lot more work for a fewer number of people, and just the way that the government responded with the funding enabled them to be able to be there for that. And Debbie can correct anything she thinks was wrong right there.
I think that probably two things. That the sector had established a very strong relationship with the federal funder.
Yeah.
And so at the beginning of the pandemic, we knew we had a space to have real honest conversation about what our expectations were as a sector. I think for agencies, the biggest flexibility was the decoupling of administration costs from program delivery, which is often based on program delivery. And the fact that we have been able to continue that for 2 years and hopefully beyond the pandemic, I think was a game changer. Tara, you're absolutely right. It didn't matter if your numbers were 50% below, your funding remained at the same level. And so it created a stability within the organization. And because the federal government responded in that way, Ontario followed suit, right? And then we had organizations like United Way who stepped up and pivoted their dollars to support some of the smaller agencies who are not supported by government, and so created an overall stability within the sector. And I think those are some of the good lessons that we need to carry forward post-pandemic.
And I would also add there that, there's a lot of costs, as Debbie hinted to, administrating those rules and regulations. That's an inefficiency in what otherwise can be put to services. And I think the findings that we had in the survey about the quality of the services that were being delivered, I think speaks very highly about the effectiveness of the settlement sector, and also the other slide that talked about that the numbers being served actually were either in some cases increasing, but they were at or nearing pre-pandemic levels, I think tells you a lot about just how effective these organizations were at addressing those other kinds of issues that the funders are often so concerned about.
And for some agencies, they also had to look at service expansion, and although there were no details about service expansion, so one of the things that agencies were finding, for example, agencies who weren't necessarily working on violence against women, but all of a sudden were hearing from their female clients that violence was increasing, that they were unable to attend classes, as the commenter online talked about issues of privacy, right? All of a sudden, the abusive spouse is in the house. Children who were able to go to school and so got a break from abusive family situations were now stuck at home as well. So agency staff were dealing with some really heavy and challenging issues that they hadn't in the past. So when we talked about, although numbers may have been stable or lower, the service demands were increasing as well, which I think was reflected in the survey as well. So not seeing any question and coming to 5 p.m. Thank you so much, Tara. Thank you, John. And thanks to all of you. Great questions, great discussions. We look forward to continuing this work in partnership with you, our academic and sector partners. Valerie?
Thank you. Thank you to people who aren't here and the people who are here, and most of all, thank you to Debbie, John, and Tara for a fascinating conversation and a very informative one. Thank you very much.
I must say, I heard my nephew, the cat, Mateo, was watching all through. So Mateo, meow.
We're going to count that as a participant.
But absolutely.